Satterwhite has a very long and vaunted history with international education in Japan, ranging from Fulbright, Japan, even to our own humble institution where he was my predecessor as the U.S.-Japan relations teacher one time. So we've known him for a long time, and he always has something interesting to say, and that's why we asked him to come today. So I will turn it over to Dr. Satterwhite.
Thank you, Carl. And actually, Carl and I have something further in common. Carl's a graduate of a program called Friends World Program at Long Island University. I graduated from Friends World College while it was an actual college. So we go back without even knowing it. First of all, I'm honored to be invited in this capacity at Lakeland College, Japan's first annual conference. A little bit of pizzazz there, first annual conference on global higher education. I appreciate your confidence in my ability to share some humble but hopefully salient insights. Most attending today, and by the way, several people have heard me here, and I've never had a script, but this is such an august audience that I wrote out a script today. Most attending today are in the trenches of fostering global or internationalized education in Japan. And it has been educational for me to attend sessions all day today, hearing many analytical and practical insights from you who are active in the Gemba level. I won't try to summarize the day, and of course I wasn't in all of the sessions. But I may refer to your insights in my remarks. But thank you, though, for truly stimulating presentations and dialogue. The Q&A was, I thought, particularly active today. And thank you, Lakeland College, for organizing and hosting this path-breaking day. As some of you indeed have heard me talk in this room on topics more directly related to my academic training. I've spoken in politics of Japan at the transition to the Democratic Party leadership some years ago, and Korea. And some may even remember, Carl's already mentioned that I taught the course on U.S.-Japan relations at one point. Alan, where are you? Alan Brender twisted my arm on short notice, and I had enormous fun teaching that course. Might mention Carl was able to take the whole 16 students down to the former offices of General Douglas MacArthur. Very exciting, twisted arms to be able to do that. We had a great time doing that. So you may have heard some of those other talks. Let me provide a bit of contextual background for why I was invited today, in spite of my previous talks. This one bit here would be called Living and Breathing Global Education. I've already said everyone in the room is directly engaged in international education, whether as an educator, an administrator, or student participant, and is, each in your own way, fostering global citizenship where you live and work. My credentials in this regard may seem apparent. Last year I finished a decade at the helm of Fulbright, Japan, a position I was truly privileged to hold, which also coincided with a decade on the boards, for instance, of JAFSA, Japan's Association of International Educators, and several other institutions, educational institutions here in town, including 10 years on the board at that other Temple University until December of last year. Less apparent is the background that got me to those positions. So let me share several vignettes. Some of you who heard me in this room earlier know I like to share vignettes. Those illustrate something of how I have lived and breathed global, internationalized education. And this part of it may go on a bit too long. Does anyone have the cattle prod to stop me? Okay. But it's part of credentialing in a different sense than those titles of positions that I've held. And maybe directly germane to some of the comments I make later about this very important and ongoing process of globalization of education in Japan. Vignette number one. Imagine in 1972. Now, for some of you, you can't imagine, except for the history books. A 20-year-old studying in Kyoto. I was back in Kyoto on a roots experience because I had grown up in Kyoto from age 6 months and had my K through 11 experience, usually we say 12, K through 11 experience in international schools. First in Kyoto, what's now Kyoto International School. I was a charter member when it was called Kyoto Christian Day School, a long time ago. And then the Canadian Academy in Kobe, which just this past year celebrated its 100th anniversary. Those, incidentally, are islands. The large number of international schools in Japan are sort of islands of early international education. But islands also in the sense that they're somewhat elitist. And I don't say I was part of the elite, but the vast majority of citizens of this country either don't have the resources or the strength in English to be able to have that international education. I remonstrated with my parents. Why didn't you send me to Japanese schools? At least I would be able to read and write better than I can in Japanese now. But the idea of having an international education while being brought up in Japan is something that I benefited from as well, in terms of being bicultural, perhaps bilingual. So I was in the middle of vignette number one saying, this time in 1971 to 73, I was in an experiential learning program at Frenchville College, focused on Japan and East Asia. The East Asian center of the college was based in Kyoto. So this 20-year-old is embarking on study travels to South Korea. Those are mine white mustard. Wow, doesn't fall. Please. So I was saying, as a 20-year-old, I embarked on a study travel to South Korea as one of 6 Americans. We ended up in Korea with Seoul National University students and students from Gakushūin University in a formal program for 1 week. We were there for 2 weeks. I was the only one who spoke, able to speak Japanese, much less Korean. None of us spoke Korean. But the cultural encounter, the adventure, and life-changing impressions were immense. Even the hated Japanese language, forced on Korea during the colonial era, became a tool for communication. And as mentioned, the cultural and educational encounter was fairly intense. It was life-changing, in fact. Later, I did my graduate training in Korean studies, not Japanese studies. I had a Fulbright for dissertation research at Korea University in Seoul, not here in Japan. And so you can imagine, as a 20-year-old, it must have been a fairly intense educational encounter. That's sort of vignette number one, or 1 and 2, if you count the fact that I was back in Japan pursuing an international education. This time, rather than being brought up here, it's really searching it out. And as I described it, something of a roots experience. In that same college program, which was unique in its own right, You could enter at any one of 6 world centers, but to graduate, you had to spend a minimum of 6 months in one of the other two of the other world centers. In that capacity, a year later, here I was, probably 21 at that time, spending 3 months behind the Iron Curtain, traveling through Hungary, the then Yugoslavia, the then Czechoslovakia, Poland, East Germany, and emerging through Checkpoint Charlie. That was one of the gateways between the separated parts of Berlin. But during that period, literally standing in, I think it would be Wenceslas Square in Prague, 5 years to the day after the Soviet tanks had rolled in to suppress Prague Spring. Reading about the Cold War as history is one thing, but having stood there, and then I mentioned going through Checkpoint Charlie, because of the people I had met along the way or been introduced to, going back and forth through Checkpoint Charlie several times, carrying, we'll say, foodstuffs and chocolates and documents back and forth between the parts of divided Germany. It wasn't history books, it was living and experiential global education. I benefited from those, and so vignette number 3 was one of my ways of giving back. And I think many of us are giving back in their own ways. Imagine almost 20 years later, in 1990-91, this same international wanderer, now a scholar, leading 34 undergraduate university students from America through 9 Asian nations for a full academic year on the road, September through June, and for a full year's academic credit, I might say. There's a bumper sticker on American car bumpers that says, "It's the grading they pay us for, the rest we do for fun." I taught 3 of those courses out of 8 on the road and graded another 5 of them. The rest we do for fun. But the classroom for this was an intense and social and cultural encounter with those 9 societies, in addition to formal coursework. I taught my Korean politics course, for instance, while we were in South Korea for a month. On one of our days of guest lectures, we had, for instance, 2 candidates for the presidency of the country. In the morning, the gentleman now departed, later president himself, Kim Dae-jung, Nobel Peace Prize winner, who I had had the privilege of working with for a decade. And in the afternoon, another gentleman named Kim Young-sung. On the way back to our university campus that day, from our experiential learning of being there during the beginning of the presidential campaign, commented that probably that day we had met a future president of the country, not knowing that we had met 2 future presidents of the country. That same trip, I was able to organize the first group of American students to Laos since the war, since the Vietnam War had ended in 1975. We were the 3rd group to Vietnam for a month, sojourning through the country, cultural spots, historic spots during the war, including a very, very moving visit to a village known as Song Mi. Americans came to know it as Mi Lai. But this was powerful stuff. And I'm happy to say I've been invited back to the Seattle-Tacoma area week after next for a reunion of the Pacific Rim program that I directed. Our orientation year was 25 years ago. And so seeing the 34, or many of them, that I had on that trip, this many years later, they're older now than I was as director of that program. And I'm keen to see what impact it might have had on their lives and their global worldview. The point of these, rather than sort of tooting for one's horn, is to illustrate an intense personal exposure to international studies and a lifelong commitment to nurturing and enabling study abroad as a vital tool to foster a global worldview. I'm going to repeat, a global worldview. A recognition that we are on a finite planet in amazingly diverse social, cultural, economic, I'd say religious, and political human community, and need not only to understand each other, but to proactively strive to live and promote cooperative, peaceful relations. That is a worldview, and each of us needs to be committed to it. Let me put this into an academic and somewhat pedagogical context. And I do so not to push a culturally imperialist notion, but to articulate and illustrate an underlying foundational approach that informs my own trajectory, my own philosophy of education, and perhaps that of many others here today. That is to call your attention to a parallel between liberal arts philosophy and an education that goes global. I define liberal arts education as acquiring the skills by which to ask questions and be a lifelong learner. That's what we try to do as educators, I think. Not provide the information, but provide the skills to ask those questions and to keep learning and questioning for the rest of your life for some purpose. If you take this baseline approach into a global context, it means placing education not in the classroom or the credentials of a degree, but within society, the workplace, the career decisions, and ultimately, how we encounter society both in our own cultures and on the planet. Let me confess to a room of educators, scholars and students, that I take this a step further. It's a step not often acknowledged by scholars as we labor under, sorry, I'm having trouble reading my own writing, as we labor under strict rules of objectivity and neutrality. We blanch at being labeled normative. So let me put this a bit differently, using the example of Zen monks in a Kyoto or Fukuiken monastery. When you step in to use the communal bath, the onsen or the ofuro, be sure to leave it cleaner than when you got there. On a planet plagued by global issues, whether warming or climate change, or wars or other kinds of conflict, what we do each day needs to be geared to making the world a better place than we love. That, I contend, means doing what we do as educators with a clear mission. And the one we happen to have that has brought us together today is to grasp and nurture a more global, internationalized educational environment and student graduates here in Japan. What are we up against? And what might be some of our collective goals? In the very last session, I think it was, somebody described all of the obstacles one has to overcome. And these were always listed up as obstacles where you can't do it because of this, that, or the other. You can't have that woman's salon because everyone's too busy or not enough students, faculty speak English, etc. Can't do it for all those reasons. There are, subtly and not often articulated, perceived cultural obstacles to a more truly internationalized or globalized education in Japan. The unique qualities of a pristine, insular Japanese culture and collective ways of thinking, perhaps epitomized by the phrase shimaguni konju. We don't normally articulate that as an obstacle to globalization, but I've just listed it first. And I'll come back because I have enormous affection and respect for Japanese culture. Fears of being diluted, or worse even, contaminated by the other, uchi and soto. Or how many devils are waiting when you go out the gate? 7 devils are waiting outside the warning. The debate over ways to reinvigorate Japan's deflation-plagued economy at a time of declining population and shrinking workforce often include increased immigration as one among several solutions. Deregulated immigration may bring much needed labor, but many in Japan fear that it will have the effect of diluting or undermining, even corrupting Japanese culture. Ties in. Those who study abroad bring back corrupted, you could read Americanized or Westernized, individualistic ways of thinking, which undermines a more comfortable, harmonious community. A community in which you are supposed to read the air, to avoid disharmonious disruptions. If you have your own opinions and you express them, whether you've been asked or not, as for instance most Americans do, you're going to disrupt things in a cultural context. You are not properly reading the air around you. Empowering women and enhancing their role in the workforce, too, is a central tenet of arguments to counter the demographics of both the population itself and of a shrinking workforce. Put half of this population more properly to work. Kathy Matsui over at Goldman Sachs and her analysis of many, many others have shown an anticipated rise in the GDP, the economy of Japan, 10 to 15%. Like that, when women are more properly put into the workforce. That is a stunning figure for a developed economy. This, however, strikes at the heart of culturally expected norms of gender roles in Japan. So, while deemed appropriate and necessary in a theoretical or economic sense, the reality is that such a shift threatens the entire social fabric. Men in the workplace, women there until marriage or children, or choosing career over family or children. And we know the benefits, but we know the obstacles and the naysayers, and who isn't hiring or promoting women into the same context of a track towards management, directorship, and leadership of corporations in Japan. What I'm getting with, what I'm getting at with these examples is a set of culturally rooted arguments that have actually stood in the way of a more proactive embrace of internationalization and globalization thus far, and tend to hem some of the initiatives in, even as there is increased public awareness of the need to foster and cultivate global citizens in an irreversibly global environment. I say irreversibly. I'm not a globalist, but rather the internet has brought us immensely much closer together. Economics does not stop at the border. It is transnational and global. And unless we have a solar flare that takes out all of the internet, and therefore all of the transactions economically as well, it's here to stay. And will likely only continue. Darling, I have to see I'm supposed to finish. Paul Harvey used to say, page 2. Something. Although the next example should be more nuanced, in the interest of time, let me just say, one looks at the emphasis placed by the Ministry of Education on inculcating global education. But, as Carl, your talk this morning also pointed out, global education, but, quote, from a Japanese perspective, and, quote, maintaining Japanese identity. Or, you've heard, quote, teaching English or other foreign languages too early will confuse the youth and will undermine their ability to grasp the Japanese language properly. So I think we've shifted to a few hours a month in 5th grade. Now, even though Korea and China, if I'm not mistaken, now provide English language instruction from grade 1. Universally. And it goes without saying that many, many children growing up in European and some other nations are multilingual from a very young age and more globally minded and conversant from the outset as a result. Many of these points will no doubt resonate with this audience, but understand that I present them not as a criticism, but as a critique, and an important difference between those two. I've spent 44 years in this country, from when I was 6 months old, and in all, 44 years. I have a long-term commitment to this country, and my critique is because I have enormous affection for this country. If we are going to be seriously engaged in Urobaru Jinzai Ikuse, the fostering of human resources capable of thinking and working globally, we need to be aware of and thoughtfully respond to concerns that Japan's enormously deep and rich culture will somehow suffer as a consequence. In other words, there are these concerns, and we need to be very aware of them and be able to respond and say, wait a minute, do I look Japanese? I had the privilege of studying experientially in Japan. I did what I call okome no ichinen. You've never heard that phrase in Japanese. Okome no ichinen. What does that mean? It means being in the tambo, getting it ready, and going over and doing the taube, the transplanting, and then doing the samshiri all summer, and then doing the inekari, and later being able to eat the shimai, and maybe drink something made from rice. And how important to Japanese culture and Asian culture is that cycle? How important is it even in TPP negotiations, that the farmers be protected? But I also had the privilege of sitting in Zazen, Yoshinji, or learning the shakuhachi, and so on. I was appreciating Japanese culture, not as a foreigner somehow diluting or corrupting it. And there is a depth of appreciation that most international visitors and residents in Japan have the longer they're here. But we need to be able to respond to those concerns because they serve as a major block for our efforts at globalization, true internationalization and globalization. Let me shift gears to an area that will sound more specific, but bring some of these points into focus as well. And reminders should be worried. I have 2 more pages. I've entitled this section, Study Abroad versus Study Abroad at Home. And I wrote a piece several years ago, I'll come back to it. It was called A Perfect Storm Analogy. So it says, and this is also from the title of the piece I penned almost 5 years ago, the subtitle of which was Long-Term Crisis for Japan, as an attempt to assess the complex trends, projections, and implications of the dramatic decline in study abroad from Japan, and an attempt as well to respond with predictions, recommendations, and policy-driven solutions to a perceived crisis. So we want to explore and emphasize the benefits of internationalizing education with Japan, yet also be aware of the dangers of promoting this as a substitute for encountering other societies firsthand through study abroad opportunities. Do I need to restate that? So study abroad at home, and there are many opportunities, and we're in a college that permits that and enables that, should not be a substitute for actually carrying your body overseas and encountering study abroad, different cultures. Reflect with me briefly on the socioeconomic, historical, and cultural context for promotion of study abroad in the post-World War II era, and then compare the 1970s and 1980s with the post-bubble decades, particularly post-1997 or so. Most of you are quite familiar with the bell curve depicting the rapid rise and then the rapid decrease of Japanese study abroad trends, particularly to the United States. So there was a peak of 3 years in 1995 to 1997 of 47,000 Japanese students in the United States each of those years. From that peak of 47,000 a year, the latest numbers are at about 19,996, in other words, less than 20,000 Japanese students abroad. That's 2-year-old statistic. In those earlier decades, society as a whole, including parents, schools, employers, governmental ministries, virtually everybody encouraged study abroad, and the rise of economic power made this affordable for post-war families. You might say a societal oikaze, a tailwind, helped drive those very large numbers of Japanese students to study abroad. There have been varied analyses of the causes of the decline over the last, particularly the last 15 years of study abroad. From my vantage point, until last year as Executive Director of the Fulbright Program, it's called the Japan-U.S. Educational Commission, I responded to numerous assertions that the real culprit behind the decline was the so-called inward-looking, grass-eater phenomenon, blaming the youth for having lost the hunger and the sense of adventure for study abroad. We've heard the word today, uchimuki, in some of the discussion. As mentioned, I wrote a piece, not for publication, but I can share it if you like. It was entitled Long-Term Crisis for Japan, a perfect storm analysis of a decade-long decline in the number of Japanese students departing for studies abroad. Okay, that was a long title, like the one from my talk today. Thank you, Carl, not for reading that, but for taking half the session. But a perfect storm analysis. For those not familiar with English, a perfect storm. No storm is perfect. But when all of the factors that lead to a storm come together, so the geography, the coastline, the direction of the winds, the atmospheric pressure, all of that comes together, you can have a terrible storm. And we call it a perfect storm for some reason. I'll spare you the full details, but I pointed out that there is a full complex of 14 to 15 factors that had come together to dissuade, to serve as obstacles for Japan's youth to venture abroad. A key assertion in my piece was that blaming or scapegoating the youth, the Untitled, was totally inappropriate. That was 1 out of 15 factors. Both because we knew the numbers wishing to study abroad was not declining. But more importantly, as it was society itself that had ceased to emphasize, encourage, and support study abroad. Added to post 9/11 in London and Madrid, safety concerns, rising costs every year, cost of higher education in the U.S. rising faster than inflation. The rise of the internet, ironically, you don't have to go because you can look everything up. You can see Vienna or almost smell the pasta. Many other factors. Right? So, in addition to all of those, a few key factors, others than I emphasized, were a shift from senior year to junior year recruiting pressures on campus. So the Mayadashi of Shutatsu to the third year. Second would be employers discounting study abroad as favorable to the job search, emphasizing your club activities, who you know, how popular you are, what leadership experience have you had. And I know that society as a whole was no longer pushing or encouraging and making it possible to study abroad, returning with those heightened skills and an altered worldview. The most recent evidence of this trend, you may have seen, was the April 28 Japan's Productivity Center survey data that has found that only 50.1%, so 50% of those seeking or already employed would accept overseas assignments. And that number is already down 5 years from just a year earlier, 4.9%, fewer percent of a very statistically robust survey say that they would not accept an assignment overseas for their work. But this is in a context of employees over the last decade or so downplaying or even concealing the fact that they studied abroad. There is, of course, the classic case of even Ministry of Foreign Affairs officials who preferred not to be posted abroad. Ministry of Foreign Affairs officials preferring not to be posted abroad. In short, and I'm coming close to the last page, society as a whole, from government, employers, families, school counselors, together, dissuaded, convinced people not to study abroad. As we saw enormous emphasis in Korea, Taiwan, and China as a whole on a societal study abroad, so an emphasis on study abroad opportunities. And the numbers of students going abroad from each of those territories or countries has grown exponentially. With that same kind of oikaze, tailwind from society, Japan also saw. And that same hungry spirit, as they call it, the Japanese students used to have to exhibit in going abroad. Japanese society as a whole has turned Ichigo. That is why I argued that we shouldn't blame the youth. Pointing to the complex of factors around this trend, behind this trend, as a crisis for Japan's competitiveness going forward, I urged concerted action involving several key players to turn the trend around and to proactively encourage study abroad. I'm sure all of you do. These players needed to include the government of Japan, especially the Ministry of Education, but also METI, Ministry of the Economy, needed to include the corporate sector, and especially their recruiters, because there's a disconnect between what the CEOs might say and what the recruiters are looking for. And the universities themselves need to be involved as a key player. The latter, to push the on-campus job search back to the senior year where it belongs. You know, there used to be a social contract that the universities collectively said, don't you come on campus until the senior year. And the declining economy and the competition among employers for the best possible graduates that you're producing pushed onto the campuses, and the universities, there's a good English word for this, abrogated their collective responsibility to push back. The third year, when you have those content courses that we've been talking about today, is when your juniors are already out on the job market and missing much of the content. And it's also traditionally the time for junior year study abroad. And that entire year can't be used anymore because as a junior, as a third-year student, you are concerned to miss out on the all-important shukatsu, as the son then said. And so the universities have to push back. I certainly do not take credit for what has happened in the last 3 to 4 years, but others also perceived the crisis proportions and have acted. We've seen this in the US-Japan case with the revitalization of a government organization known as Colcon, and the release by Colcon last June of a very serious study with many, many recommendations. And the culmination of that, you might have seen just at about the time of President Obama's visit, study abroad doubling plan. Okay, if you double the numbers right now, you're still not back up to the peak between Japan and the US. But a plan to double study abroad between Japan and the United States, literally over the next 10 years. Bravo. It needs to happen. Let's see. We've also seen this in a whole raft of programs of the initiative of the Ministry of Education, focused heavily not only on the flow of international students to Japan and Japanese students abroad, but on promoting globalized education in Japanese universities. We heard a summary of these governmental initiatives in Professor Kuwamura's presentation this morning, and it caught my attention that the last 3 years have seen not only a very large number of programs, but a quadrupling of governmental funds allocated to these initiatives than we had seen at the time of the Global 30 just 5 years ago. So you won't be able to see it from there, but this is Global 30 at 4.1 billion yen. This is collectively Global 30, Reinventing Japan, Go Global Japan, and Top Global University Project, over 12.7 billion yen. That's real money. serious money. And it's impressive. It's overdue, but it's a very, very, very important start. Clearly, what we have seen is a concerted shift of focus, responding to the crisis through global Jinsai. I should have said, not on that list is the Global 30 Plus, and I was privileged to go and hear many of those very interesting presentations by those universities who had either competed for or gotten Global 30 Plus funds. And so the term, Global Jinsai Ikse, what you all are all involved in, before that we came up with the title, they came up with the title, fostering human resources capable of thinking and acting and working globally. So it says concluding thoughts, well overdue. As a long-term resident of Japan, and as one who has remained vocally, publicly optimistic about the enormous strengths and potential of Japan and its people going forward, I'm encouraged by this shift in focus and by the allocation of serious funds to those ends. I'm also encouraged by our collective efforts, evidenced by a great gathering today, and by what each of you are doing in the gemba of your encounter with Japanese students. I've gone on at much too great a length, and if we have some minutes, I suspect, Ron, would be pleased to hear your insights and reactions and your critique. I would then be very pleased to share a sip of wine at the reception to follow. Thank you for your enormous patience.
Thank you very much, Dr. Satterwhite. Unfortunately, as you said, time is of the essence, and there is pizza waiting. So,
Pizza getting cold.
Oh, it won't be cold yet, but we don't want to risk it. So, if you can hold your questions for the end, we will wrap up today's session with some closing remarks from Jennifer Siebert, who's joined us all the way from Wisconsin and lugged a suitcase full of these wonderful blue lanyards that are all wearing. The Director of International Programs for Lakeland College. We're very happy to have her here today.
I'll use the microphone. I am not going to make a long closing remark. I'll just say remark. I was really happy to be able to be here for this. It was a wonderful day. I'm glad that Alan invited me to be here during this week so that I could be here today and participate. I was fascinated by a lot of the presentations that I was able to sit in on. I was honored to moderate one of them. And I hope to see you all at the reception. So on behalf of Lakeland College, thank you so much for coming today. And thank you to Dr. Satterwhite, to everybody who organized this event. I think it was a success.
Okay, I guess that means it's time to talk about pizza. So, for those of you who are joining us for the reception, we have maps just here, and several of us know where we're going, I hope. So, if you'll hang out for just a few minutes.